You've heard AM, you've heard FM. Now, tune into DM Radio, the world's longest running show about data. Each week, host Eric Kavanagh interviews the brightest minds in the world of information management. Want to be on a show? Send an email to info@dmradio.biz. Now, here's your host, Eric Kavanagh.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanagh here. A little bit sluggish today, not going to lie. Was at Click World the last few days and took the red eye home, and we got to Chicago fine, and then that plane had some problems, and they had to decommission the plane, which was fun. I watched one of the workers in the airport look at the people outside. She said, "What are they working on?" I'm like, "Uh-oh, that's not a good sign." And sure enough, decommissioned the plane. We had to wait. Lady gives the whole lowdown. They were calling headquarters, getting a new plane from downtown, all this stuff. So yeah, we were supposed to be home this morning. Got home 10 minutes ago, just in time for the show on dark data. So this is good stuff. Dark data. We were witnessing asset management in Chicago. As I explained to my wife, I said, this is an asset management issue. Where are our assets and how can we get them there? How can we align the appropriate parties to get the asset to this gate and get these people back to Pittsburgh? And they did a pretty good job. I mean, it wasn't too bad. Stuff breaks, stuff breaks all the time. That's one thing that scares me all the time, is this concept of things breaking. But so the topic today is dark data. I love this concept. We're going to talk to Andrew Ahn of Praxi Data and our very own Dr. Robin Bloor, Chief Analyst of the Bloor Group. And dark data refers to the data that you can't see, that you don't know is there, but is there. And it's all over the place. As I put in the abstract for this show, and folks, you can always be part of our virtual studio audience by logging in to the Zoom webinars we use to record these shows. But yeah, so as we've learned ourselves, dark data is everywhere. It's in any server that's on-prem. It can be in the cloud. It can be in some software as a service application somewhere. And most organizations really don't have a good policy or plan for being able to understand what all that is. We do have data catalogs that have come out and become very significant in the marketplace, but even that's probably for 20% of the data, maybe 30%. There's still that other 70 to 80%, a lot of it in unstructured documents. We've tried for years with things like master data management to be able to reconcile these things. But the bottom line is that it's all over the place. It's very hard to catalog and understand. And there's good value in that data that you don't see. There's also risk in the data you don't see. So that's what we'll talk about today. And let's bring in our friend Andrew Ahn from Praxi Data, former Hortonworks guy who was the Atlas person, the metadata tool from Hortonworks. So he's been around the block a few times and knows quite a few things about this whole industry in this space, and specifically about how difficult it is to get things done the old-fashioned way. So Andrew, with that, tell us what you've been doing and how you help companies illuminate dark data.
Thank you for inviting me. Great to be here. Yeah, so I'll try to keep it brief, but I think a lot of folks know what dark data is all about. Dark data sometimes refers to this kind of unknown, but dark data also includes gray data, data that you know little about, or maybe was organized or labeled, a long time ago and may not be relevant anymore. So that together represents, a potential gold mine in opportunity or potential risks. And that's really what we help to try to mitigate. And we do that using different techniques. So Praxi Data is able to automatically profile and provide meaning. We automatically label data. We do this in a different way. Many companies are able to do this. Many tools can. We focus specifically on certain verticals, specific use cases. So we can provide pre-trained libraries to do this matching and provide value much more quickly. And because we focus on a narrow band, we're able to provide much better matching capabilities, much less training required, practically none. It comes pre-trained. We have a subscription, so we're always updating it. So we think that's the right way to tackle this problem.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick because you reminded me of something that is very, very important with any tool that you use in your business on the data side, with any technology that you bring in to get things done. If it's not intuitive enough if it's not designed such that you can start to get value fairly quickly, you're going to have a really hard time getting buy-in, and you're going to have a hard time getting usage. And that happens all the time. You get companies that buy sometimes very expensive software products, and they don't really, I mean, they go into production, but they don't really get used. And, you know, a critical component to me is how quickly can you get us rolling with something that's going to show value? And it seems to me that's something you've learned over the years of being in the enterprise software industry, right?
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for that leading question there. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think that's one of the critical areas in the space that's not being addressed. We have really great tools. We have great, workspaces to create ML and get these insights. But, companies spend a lot of time ramping up, and that's just lost opportunity, right? That's time that you could be conducting new campaigns or tying up very, very valuable resources to organize that data. You don't want to make this tool so complicated that you have to change the way, companies do things. We talked about that actually before the show started. If the context that that an organization already has is fundamentally different than this tool is, designed for, that dissonance causes a lot of friction. Will result in failure for a lot of deployments. It will either lengthen the time of deployments to from months to years in some cases, or it could basically make that project fail. So the key really is to get rolling, get on the ground, show value quickly. And if you can do that, you get buy-in, and then there's excitement, and then there's also additional benefits you can get from it. So I 100% agree.
Yeah, one other thing I'll point out there for the audience to kind of help them understand, almost everyone who's been on the interwebs understands a search. You go and search for something. And the reason you can find stuff through these search engines is because these companies spent time indexing the web. They have little crawlers that go around and bring back data, metadata, et cetera. What are the text strings in this particular document on this page? And that's what you're searching. And you have enterprise search, and you have search on your Mac and all these things. So people kind of know search. But what you're doing, and where the challenge that you're addressing, is a sort of comprehensive search and tagging exercise to give some meaning to the entire corpus of texts and files that you have in your environment, right?
Absolutely. So, not so long ago, we used to call this the data lake. That idea, that notion has fortunately passed. And so you have lots of pockets of data or stores of data, right? A lot of times they're labeled differently or sometimes incorrectly. And you would never know by reading just basically the label or the top of these files. Really what you need to do is open the box, look inside, and introspect what's inside. Perhaps the data is of poor quality and maybe you don't want to use it. Maybe it's incomplete. These are the things that we can help provide. The other thing that we can provide is based upon the value, the contents of the files themselves. We can provide synonyms or alternate labels. You can call something, trousers, or you can call them pants, right? So the idea is that they should be both. We should be able to call it one thing as well as the other thing. So that's one of the things that we can do by introspection. The other thing is some files are very, very long. They're very deep. If you have 100, 1,000, 10 million rows, most search engines or tools cannot get and take a look at that entire file, right? The interesting stuff might be at the end, right? You might have strange corruption in the middle, right? So one of the things we can do when we introspect is also provide that information. Right?
This is very interesting. So I'll bring in Dr. Robin Bloor to comment on this. Robin, what impressed me about their approach is the comprehensive nature of it. And, I've wondered for a long time, and we should weave in a conversation around AI here and our good friend these days, Chat GPT, right? And of course, Databricks has their own LLM, and I've played around with this, and it is no doubt just fascinating stuff. These large language models are really interesting and intense, but the key to remember is that if you're going to point AI at your data, some algorithm to find some pattern, to enrich some process, you really should know what you're pointing it at. And most organizations cannot do that right now. So that greatly limits them in terms of what they can use to train these models. And that is not a small deal. So what I think is interesting is that these folks from Praxi Data are trying to solve for that very, very big problem, which, we've now heard. I think the probably the biggest critique of Chat GPT I've come across is the inaccuracy of things, because it just gets things wrong. And so in that sense, it's different from Google, which tried very hard to at least point you in a direction where you're going to probably find something. ChatGPT just tells you things. So we're in a very interesting space right now. But what do you think about all that, Robin?
Well, I mean, there are separate kind of strands to this. First of all, if we go towards the fundamental problem that Praxi Data is pointing its guns at, the data was always dark, in the sense that from the moment that we started to process data, we started to spin off files in all directions, before databases even, that weren't properly identified, that the metadata that defined the file was in the program that acted upon it and nowhere else. And then there was the other problem, is that human beings are a very good store of metadata, and a lot of systems work because of the metadata in the head of the human being that isn't actually in the computer.
That's right.
So, when you go to Chat GPT and its large language model can't cope with either of those things. And it has to be said that really what Chat GPT works very, very well with is text and the meaning in text. It's very good at language-based collections of data. At this point in time, you can't, to my knowledge, properly point it at your data, but even if you could, it's taken its understanding of metadata from the big world out there. It hasn't taken it from your corporation or company or whatever. And if you're going to trust it with doing things, the last thing you actually want is it getting it wrong around the data that's most valuable to you, which is your data. So I think ChatGPT's got a long way to go before it can. Probably you need a version of it that it's like, you kind of think it's very smart in some of the things it does, but you need a version of it which is
right
to stop it thinking about all of these things, and I want to add in my corporate data to it and see what it can come up with, because of the way it works, because of a large language model is a powerful piece of AI. It could come up with useful stuff, but at this point in time, it's immature to that. And it'll get there, but if it's going to get there, it actually needs what Praxi Data is doing. It needs a rich ability to define local meaning.
Yeah, and you need,
yeah.
That's an excellent point. And, Andrew, I'll bring you back into this. This whole concept around collective intelligence has been around for a while, but it seems to me to be very timely right now. And you see it, for example, with Google, when they would have their Google address. I think maybe Yahoo even did this too, where they'd have their thing of, is this your business? Claim this as your business, right? So here they are putting out what they think is the view of the world, but inviting the endpoints, the consumers, the individuals, to correct them if they're wrong. And that's what you want, right? That's the kind of system you want for your information in your enterprise data environments, right? You want to know what you have, but be able to append files, or in the old days, you would just overwrite them. Now you just kind of append that stuff ideally. So you have an audit trail, the transformations, et cetera. But that's the goal. And the point I was kind of driving at is that before you figure out a way to point AI at all your data, you better know what you have out there. Otherwise, you're going to have a very unpleasant experience at some point in time. What do you think?
Oh, that's a very great observation from both of you. We're actually cooking up something that we will be announcing soon to address some of those concerns. And actually, it was great to hear Dr. Bloor mention that. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. One of the things you don't want to do is point your data at point your AI at bad data, right? We all know what happens when you put garbage in. So the key that for enterprises, which will have typically larger data sets than the public domain, right? If you have really, really big files, something like Chat GPT cannot penetrate that and understand that in a way that's contextually accurate. So consequently, the results will be inaccurate. So this whole notion of correctness is a really, really big concern. If you're using some kind of generative AI to come up with trends or patterns to use as a data point for insurance premium calculations or risk models, it's really critical that you get those, you get that correctness, under control. And the way you do that is to control the source data. Right? You want to omit or exclude bad data, right? That will 100% skew your results. So I think that's kind of the primordial requirement for turning AI loose on your enterprise data. The other issue is around permissions. Without this notion of permissions, you're going to potentially get unintended consequences. So depending on the asker of the question, you really do need to tailor the results. And this notion of security and permissions to those source data assets is really critical. And that's something that we can provide. We can talk about more of exactly how we do that, but that's, I think, one of the critical pieces missing today.
That's a good point. And, it gets back to something I've wondered about for a long, long time, which is when you think about databases, especially older databases, as closets where you're keeping things. Well, just think about your closet. I mean, there are some people out there who have very well organized closets. I'm not one of those people, right? and disorganized closets really are depressing, honestly. I mean, if I think about it, it really bothers me. I'm like, oh, I can't think about the closet. Don't worry about the closet right now. There's too much stuff in there, and it's just so unwieldy. And that's the reality of data in these information landscapes, especially for large organizations. It's just all over the place. Copies of the same data too. What's the number? Someone came up with 6 copies of every file on average is somewhere in an organization or in their cloud environment. This is a huge challenge. As I mentioned, data catalogs tried to focus on certain critical components in the sort of ontologies, if you will, or the schematics, but nonetheless, not at the scale that you're talking about, which is to really understand what's out there across the spectrum of these source systems, of which there are hundreds, sometimes thousands, even tens of thousands. Folks, we're talking all about corralling that data, the enterprise data, finding the dark data. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanagh.
All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, talking all things dark data today with Andrew Ahn of Praxi Data and good old Dr. Robin Bloor of the Bloor Group. And Andrew, in the break, we were chit-chatting about these huge files, and just always make the analogies I like to make to make this real for people. Think about in the early days when you were playing around with music files, or even just a few years ago, movie files, for example. You want to port them over from your computer to your CD-ROM writer. Remember, we used to always burn the CD-ROMs back in the day. And it just would go on and on and on. And then the file would get corrupted. You'd go to use it and it didn't work. And that's the problem of girth in the data world. You get these big files and they just send systems cattywampus and stuff doesn't work. And Andrew, that's one of the challenges that you saw out there with companies just taking these huge files and dumping them into the cloud as a way of storing them and dealing with it, not really thinking about how hard it's going to be to catalog that stuff and understand it, right?
Absolutely. And it really locks away that application or institutional knowledge. It ties it with that file and that application. So it also has another unintended consequence, which is because it makes it very hard to become accessible to other tools. Tools like Chat GPT can't address them. So all those gigantic mainframe files, guess what? They're not cataloged. They're not searched. They're not in that gigantic language model. It's very, very hard to do that. They might be able to read the summary information about it, but that's pretty much it. They can get a report about it. But really, in order to get the best results from AI or ML, you really need access to the raw data so you can get these insights that you didn't already know. And that's really one of the problems with data today. It comes in all forms and sizes. We focus on new data, texts, social media feeds, but there is a huge amount of super valuable information from legacy systems that are still locked as well, right?
Yeah, and are you talking also about, for example, emails and Word documents and all these different documents that folks have, in particular email, for example? Is that something that you reach into as well?
We do a little bit of that. We're still working on figuring out exactly how to get real value. At the end of the day, the tool is only as valuable as the results it provides, right? That's really going to provide true value and staying power. So we're looking for, as I mentioned earlier, we're really focused on narrow use cases,
right?
Deep expertise, right? So if it doesn't fit that scope, then perhaps we'll leave it to other companies to sort through that. But we really are trying to figure out something that would be, really advance the central mission.
Yeah, and I should focus on that. It's the curation part, right? So you've got this component where you're sort of indexing and labeling things and these complex objects, but then the idea with the platform is to enable this expert curation, right? And so you provide these libraries, and that allows a sort of fast tracking of the process of going through and finding what these things are. So combining the dynamic capabilities with the expert capabilities of the individuals who are on the front lines, right?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, so we want to make something scalable, basically give these analysts superpowers. So it doesn't matter how much data they're having to deal with. They don't have to scale the people because you can't. And so that's what we provide. We provide them, a force multiplier. So we surface things that matter, so you can get your arms around it. And that's really what we're trying to do, kind of in a nutshell. The idea is not to provide, 1,000 results or 10,000 results, or that's meaningless. Really what we want to do is rank the relevance and provide stuff that matters, just like in any search. But we want to do it for a deep search, looking inside, enterprise assets, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of why I brought up search earlier. You think about Elasticsearch, for example, you think about enterprise search. Google, of course, had a whole line of business there. I mean, it's a similar process. You're trying to find something, but what you're really trying to do is help make sense of this whole, again, corpus of content, right?
Absolutely. So if we can flag interesting data, then if you use ML and AI to actually get additional insights, you can do things like find the weak signal, right? And the only way you do that is being able to address really large data sets. Obvious big swings, human beings can pick that out. That's easy. That's already been done, right? So we want to flag the things that are interesting, and then from that, really help identify areas where you can find that weak signal, find that kind of subtle correlation that you couldn't find elsewhere, right? And then use that to feed into your ML models. That's really the way you're going to get, really that hockey stick growth in innovation, right? Non-linear growth is really what they want. This is a big deal in pharmaceutical industries, right? They want to find that really weak signal that could be the key to unlocking, a big problem they're trying to solve.
Yeah, that's interesting. And Robin, I'll throw this one over to you. I'll tell you what I hear here in the conversation is knowledge management, right? Like that was a whole thing, like what, 30 years ago? And it was just before its prime. I think the technology wasn't quite there yet. And so it never quite got there. But now we have these knowledge graphs, right? And you can work at a certain scale that gets very meaningful and very interesting. What do you think?
Well, the knowledge graphs are very important because the knowledge graphs are a kind of multiplier on meaning. I mean, what Andrew's been talking about from my perspective, I'm just sitting here listening, fascinated, and he's talking about the scalability of meaning. And the problem is that, when you look at it, we've got all the iron we want out there that can tear through any heap of data, no matter how large. But it actually doesn't have a sufficient quantity of meaning, it's not going to be able to do anything useful with the data. So the question really is, how can you make the meaning scale? And the only way you're going to do it is through metadata, through some form of organizing the metadata that sits over, let's call it dark data, because that's what this discussion is about. You're going to have to do that. And you're also, and this is also a bit of a disappointment, really, but you're also going to have to involve human beings, because sometimes the metadata you need in the human beings and not actually on the computers. So you're going to have a manual element where human beings tell you that, oh, it's this, not this, and that's got to be automated, because, human beings, if it's not automated, they can't do anything nowadays.
No, that's a good point. And, back to what always gets me excited is discovery. That's what I enjoy, is discovery. Now, you want to have a certain context. And so, Andrew, maybe why don't you talk about some of these particular use cases and some of the alignment that you can get by providing these libraries. So, you could possibly call it a taxonomy, but really it's a library of entities and their synonyms, right? Such that you can then build functions that would apply to both these entities and those represented by their synonyms, and thus have a more cohesive approach to policy management. Is that right?
Yeah. And if I can make the next leap, and we kind of talked about this before, the idea is that this institutional knowledge, this metadata that you're accumulating, this enrichment of the data, currently it's locked up in applications or in people's heads. Mm-hmm. Really what we want to do is tie it to the data itself, because the data is moving, it's transforming, people come and go, but you want to lock it up at the right place, right? And applications are not the right place, because as everybody knows who's probably listening to this, everybody's in the process of, decommissioning some legacy system or integrating. That's never going to end. And with that realization, we have to figure out a way that we can make that metadata persist, that institutional knowledge persist with the data, right? And that's really the key. One of the things we do is we are constantly improving the matches that we make to provide more insight. Well, that's just going to go into the metadata. So the applications you have, the reports that you currently have, the dashboards you have, just get better. And that's really what we want to do. And as Dr. Bloor mentioned earlier, you're always going to need people in the mix. And that is true, but you can't scale people. What we really want to do is give them a catalyst, this ability to be a force multiplier, to give them the tools so they can address a larger body of data in the beginning, but still be effective and productive in what they normally do in terms of making decisions. So the idea would be to stop the amount of searching for raw data or categorizing data and spend more time making decisions. It turns out that something like 80% of a data analyst's time is still spent just finding the right data. Right? Finding the right set of data that's appropriate to give you the answers to the questions you want to ask, right? If we can reduce that, that's a huge savings in time and people.
Yeah, and it's about, again, context for the worker, for the knowledge worker, right, Robin? And there are all kinds of ways you can do this. We had portals. Remember the internet portals, the intranet? Hey, log into your intranet. We still have those. There are some very cool portals out there that companies use, and there are all kinds of ways, again, to deliver the data. But what I think is interesting here is this focus on canvassing and beginning that process of labeling what you've got and allowing your team members to do that expert curation, so they really refine their knowledge and they also catalog it while doing so, thus making it available for other people, right, Robin?
Yeah, and I mean, we'll ignore the other AI for the moment and just talk about machine learning. One of the things that's interesting about machine learning that I don't think has been emphasized particularly much is that it actually creates knowledge. So there was a relationship between this thing and that thing you didn't know about, but now you know about it because you've applied some machine learning algorithm to it and it's thrown this stuff up. So the outcome of machine learning is to give you better knowledge, which means in one way or another better metadata. But unfortunately, the metadata that you've physically got is trapped up in all of these applications. So there's also this issue of not only doing the machine learning work, but also being able to incorporate it as a fact into your data after you've done it, and to have a kind of repetitive cycle that naturally does that. And aside from all of the massive failures of machine learning projects, even the successes have not done very well with that.
Yeah. If I can add to that, if I may, that's a great point. It's this notion of collaboration. Data they're siloed in most companies. And if you come up with an asset, whether it's by through machine learning or through some project, you need some way to store it in some place so that somebody can collaborate. They can add to it, they can correct it, they can improve upon it. If it's in silos, basically you're reducing its visibility to other parts of that organization or other companies. Let's say we're trying to solve something that is a global health issue. Well, wouldn't it be great if we could share all of our data and it didn't matter the way we labeled it or named it? Of course. And that's exactly the point that we want to get to. If somebody does some machine learning and finds some interesting aspects of that data, commonalities, differences, if it's stored somewhere, somebody can pick that up and use that for a different purpose, right? This happens in pharmacology as well as many, many other contexts.
Yeah, it's data access, it's insight access, right? And what you're trying to do is grease the tracks to facilitate the reuse of data and of insights across different applications, across different environments, because what you don't want, to your point, is to have all that context trapped in a particular application or even in a particular user's login to a particular application, right, Andrew?
Yeah, and you don't want to redo the work. Like if it's
Right.
already done, why not pick up where somebody else left off, right? Hand the ball off to somebody else and they can do something with it. And now it's available for somebody else to, riff on and make, additional insights.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is very, very interesting, and it kind of gets back to, you even sort of mused there about how we had this bad idea of a data lake, and I remember thinking to myself, all right, we built the data warehouse and then figured out that the world is just too wild and woolly and unwieldy to have this be the centralized place, and then we do a data lake and did it all again. It's like, well, wait a minute, isn't the world really federated? And shouldn't we have solutions that can sort of reach across all these different environments? And to be able to access it wherever it is and leverage it accordingly, right, Andrew?
Absolutely. The time it takes to move that body of data to put it into one place so you can do your analytics, that itself is such a Herculean task that most often it doesn't succeed, right? It's a huge undertaking, as most listeners to your program will know. Sometimes it's better not to move the data. Leave it where it is. It's being used. It's a live data set. So leave it alone. But if you can understand it well enough, then it's still accessible, like you said earlier. It's still part of this larger body of data that can be used for collaboration, search, and additional analysis without messing up what you've already got.
Right. No, that's exactly right. And again, people understand the search metaphor. Go to Google, search for something. The Chat GPT model is new and different and has its own quirks, etc. But they did something very clever, which is, I think, to create more of a workspace instead of just this field that you type your query into. I mean, Google historically has not done very much with the landscape they're given, which has been kind of their thing. But anyway, folks, we'll be right back. Don't touch that dial. You're listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanagh.
All right, folks, welcome back to DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanagh, here with Andrew Ahn of Praxi Data and Dr. Robin Bloor today, talking all things dark data, the data that you don't see. It is out there. It's in lots of different formats, on different file systems, and on different boxes in the cloud and applications. It's all over the place. And getting your hands around it is not the easiest thing to do sometimes. And just visualizing it can be a challenge, right? And Andrew, you've got this concept of a data map that you talk about, and is your map impossible to navigate? Well, navigation is also a very interesting challenge, right? So the more complex the schematic becomes, the harder it is to understand. How do you sort of balance out the needs of keeping things simple enough to understand, but rich enough to have meaning? What do you think about that?
Interesting question. And it's a good one. When faced with, too long of a list, what do? Well, in modern UIs, you just search, right? And now we're depending upon the ranking of the search. That's why Google's so great at searches, right?
Right.
Likewise, for enterprises, that map becomes less and less valuable unless it's already filtered. And that's the key element here. You need to keep things into a manageable size. Human beings can only address so many different choices before bad things happen. And so usually the things that matter are not that many. It's a handful. So despite the scale of the data, despite the scale and the elements on your map to navigate, you only really care about a few things at any given time. So that's one of the things that we've incorporated in our design and in our APIs, and the way our application works is to provide that value from a contextual standpoint and to rank it correctly.
Ranking correctly, and that, I mean, that's a good point too. Robin, I'll throw this at you. What's the old joke about the loneliest place on the internet? Page 2 of Google search results. Like, who gets the page 2? And these days they have so many freaking ads. I mean, it's unbelievable. For some hot topics, you'll do your search and there will be like 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 ads before you get to the first non-ad piece of content, which I think also is kind of hurting their business. It's the downside of success, I suppose, because they've done so well in selling stuff, but now like, okay, is that another ad? It's getting hard. I mean, just as an aside, I was kind of impressed that on YouTube, they've been able to greatly ratchet up the commercials per hour of content than you had on TV, which was already a ton, like unless you pay, like with cable. But anyway, I digress somewhat. The point is that to Andrew's point, you can only see so much. And so that context is really, really important, especially context within the context of a workflow of a particular business process, right?
Yeah, right. So, and the interesting thing here, to me anyway, is that the most interesting thing about Chat GPT is the questions, not the answers, because the questions you can ask can refine the search you're making down to what it is that you want. And the signal noise position, as in respect of its answer, is just really very, very good. It appears with no adverts. It even appears with no extraneous words. The only thing you have to worry about is its source. But so, that's turned search into intelligent people able to ask intelligent questions and get really good responses. I do not use Google anymore to search for anything because I'm a researcher, basically. To research anything, I don't use Google anymore. It's hopeless. And that's an interesting thing after a fashion, because the same problem goes for any heap of data. The fact that Chat GPT has got a good solution for the internet in the large language sense is great, but it doesn't have anything it doesn't even look to me like the correct technology for the same thing, which is what I would like to do as an individual in a corporation, is ask intelligent questions that are very well refined and have a very, very swift answer without having to go through any kind of manipulation of the data in order to put in, I don't know, a data lake or a special database or whatever, in order for me to answer the questions I want. I just want to have a kind of conversational interaction with the data. That's what is going to happen in the end, irrespective of who provides what technology for it. Because ChatGPT is going to make the corporations, as they've done before, time and again, ask for, I want something like that does this to my data. And they'll ask ChatGPT first, but ChatGPT hasn't got an answer to that. So they're going to look elsewhere.
That's very interesting. So I was at the ClickWorld conference the last few days, and I was talking to Dan Bessett from, I guess he's from IDC, and Sean Rogers and a couple other people. We were just talking about where things are going. And my big question is what we've kind of discussed here is, well, will these large language models provide enterprise value until you can do a sort of single tenant engine for your company that is yours inside your walled garden? And at that point, it gets very interesting. And I think, Andrew, what you're providing could be that intermediary layer that allows an engine like an LLM to kind of weave in and understand and connect those dots, because that's where it seems to be making mistakes. Like when it told me that I wrote 3 books, which I have not yet written, at least, it conflated me with someone else but you could correct that in your own environment and say, oh no, actually, my GPT, I didn't write those. Oh, okay, thank you. And then it remembers that, right? I mean, that's a sort of big picture vision of where these things are going. But, just getting back to your particular use cases, there's a lot of value in not reinventing wheels and finding out who has worked on a problem in the pharmaceutical trying to treat MS with this particular protocol or these particular features. That's a very complicated search for a traditional search algorithm to do, but not with a solution like yours or this layer of abstraction of metadata, right?
Oh, absolutely. And each enterprise is going to have a very specific type of vocabulary, right? That is not used in the public. If you ask, Google or other search engines very specific technical questions, you might get the answer, but it's going to be buried amongst a lot of noise, right? Whereas inside your walled garden, you've already kind of focused on certain types of use cases or certain domains. And so the results you get back will just be better. It's going to be contextually more accurate and more relevant. And it's going to have refinement with perhaps proprietary ideas or concerns that you cannot make public. But because it's private, you can get this higher level of tailor-fit answer. The context will just be better because of that. And over time, it will be quite a huge asset. If it is internal, those assets can then, of course, be saved, elaborated on, and built upon, kind of as we were talking about earlier. So if you're able to do this, and I like what Dr. Bloor said, having a conversation with your data, if you can save that and share that and collaborate with that, that itself becomes an asset that is very valuable to an organization.
Yeah, I mean, this is really a fascinating time. If you look at, just to make another analogy here, in GitHub with Copilots, right, where it's kind of helping you write code, like, oh, I think you're trying to write this. I think you're trying to do this kind of functionality. And it'll kind of help you say, hey, how about this? How about that? These are suggestions. And I really think that is the direction of AI in general. But again, the AI will only be as good as your knowledge management practices and data management practices and awareness, and that's the missing ingredient, I think. So I guess what I'm saying is I think that what you've built here can be a great layer of abstraction for managing the meaning of things and doing so at scale, where again, you can apply certain functions like around PII, for example, that would then at least reach across the spectrum and tag everything appropriate. And then you can, of course, go in and manually untag things in search. And that's what the people need to do. You're training the model. You're ever refining the model over time, right, Andrew?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Another thing that we can do to get to this idea of this abstraction, this metadata layer, is that we're able to, of course, get understanding and insights about data that maybe something like a Chat GPT can't. It's not able to penetrate really large data sets. And so we're able to do that. And we can provide the metadata that it otherwise wouldn't be able to get. So there's more tools in that toolbox for an enterprise with Praxi Data for generative AI than perhaps just, the public version.
Well, and it is sort of a call to arms here. I mean, we were kind of talking about that. ChatGPT and it being rolled out now is a call to arms to other players. I will say Elon Musk, when he called for a pause in development, I was like, kidding, right? Are you being serious? Is this the Babylon Bee or something? What are you talking about? No way that's going to happen, buddy. No way, 100%. But it's wonderful, interesting times. Always great to have Dr. Robin Bloor on the show. If you want to be on the show, send me an email, info@dmradio.biz. Look up Andrew Ahn, that's AAHN of Praxi Data, Praxi.